In the first half of the 20th century, there were women whose fame did not come from office invention or dynasty, but from the disciplined performance of desire. Women who moved through the richest rooms in America like a rumor given a body. Their currency was not simply beauty, but timing the instant a nation decided it wanted spectacle more than truth, and wanted women to serve as the visible proof that money could purchase anything except peace. In that world, a woman could become a headline without ever becoming secure, could be envied without ever being safe. And when the decade changed, when the cameras shifted, when the men who once competed began to age into caution, the same story repeated with a different face and the same end, a life spent converting attention into security and discovering, too late, that attention never holds its value. The name that survives from that era is not a stage name so much as a warning disguised as glitter. Peggy Hopkins Joyce. She was born Emma Marguerite Upton in Berkeley, Virginia in 1893, and she died in New York City in 1957, a span of years that contained vaudeville Broadway, the Jazz Age, the Depression War, and the slow tightening of American past. Respectability into something less forgiving. In the newspapers, she was a socialite, a dancer, an actress, a model, sometimes a columnist, often a scandal, almost always a symbol. She was married 6 times, spoke of engagements as if they were a hobby, collected diamonds with the methodical hunger of someone stocking a pantry for a famine she could already feel approaching. Her story does not need exaggeration. It only needs to be watched in order. At the end, the light is wrong for glamour. It is hospital light, flat, indifferent, exposing the architecture of a face without mercy. In early June of 1957, a woman whose public life had once been described in terms of jewels, furs, and men with fortunes is admitted to a cancer hospital in New York City, not to be photographed, not to be admired, but to be treated, quietly, as one more patient among many. She is 64. The papers that once counted her diamonds now count her days. Within less than 2 weeks, she is dead, not in a mansion, not on a yacht, not in the kind of theatrical final scene a legend might demand, but in a room designed for endings that do not pause to ask whether the person inside was ever famous. Her name, still recognizable, still sharp with old laughter, does not protect her from the one humiliating equality that comes for everyone. The body becoming matter, the voice becoming a medical problem, the future becoming a file. Throat cancer is an especially cruel verdict for a woman who lived by talk, by interviews, by vows, by negotiations, conducted like flirtation, by the practiced ability to turn a sentence into a weapon or a promise into a price. There is an irony that feels almost procedural, a life built on being seen, and an ending that takes place under lighting meant to make everyone look the same. Long before that room, long before the cancer diagnosis and the quiet funeral arrangements, she existed as a kind of moving proof that the American dream had a jewelry case and that the lock could be opened with the right smile. She was written about as if she were a phenomenon rather than a person. She was the punchline in comedians' routines, and the kind of name songwriters could drop into lyrics with the confidence that the audience would understand what it meant. A woman whose notoriety was so immediate it became shorthand for a certain kind of luxury that looked like freedom and often behaved like captivity. At her height, she did not merely spend money. She performed spending, turning consumption into theater. She had the instinct of someone who knew that in the modern age, wealth is not only owned, it is displayed, narrated, made public so that it can become real. She could receive reporters in intimate settings and treat scandal as if it were an accessory, an extension of the same logic that made diamonds necessary. If the world insists on watching, then the watching should be profitable. And yet, even in the most extravagant accounts of her life, there is always a faint undertow of something colder than decadence, the impression that every gift was also a transaction, every marriage also a contract, every room also a stage from nisbeasing, which she could be removed at any moment. The paradox begins there, not with her death, but with her method. She built an empire out of proximity to power, and the closer she got, the more obvious it became that proximity is not possession. The unsettling part is not that she married rich men, or that she divorced them, or that she wore her diamonds with an almost aggressive pleasure. Plenty of women in that era navigated money through marriage because the law and custom made other paths narrow and punishing. The unsettling part is how early she learned the structure of the trap and still stepped into it, how she treated romance as finance, not out of cynicism, but out of survival instinct, as if the world had already taught her that love was unreliable and money was the closest thing to permanence available. She left home. Young attached herself to movement, to the itinerant logic of vaudeville and trains and temporary arrangements, and in that motion, she encountered wealth. The way a starving person encounters a banquet not with patience but with urgency. She married as a teenager into money that did not truly accept her, and the arrangement collapsed almost as quickly as it began annulled when her underage status became inconvenient, as if the law itself were reminding her that even when she was chosen, she was still not fully allowed. But she learned what mattered in that brief transaction. A man's fortune could be reached briefly through access to his name, and the cost of entry was not tenderness, but performance. Soon after she acquired the education of a different kind of woman, private schooling, the polish that could make poverty less visible, yet even that refinement carried its own quiet message that the surface must be corrected, improved, controlled, because the surface is what decides whether the doors open. She would spend the rest of her life building surfaces like fortresses, only to discover that surfaces are where the damage is easiest to see. Stories like hers appear most often in periods of transition, when societies renegotiate what women are allowed to want and what price they are expected to pay for wanting it openly. Peggy Hopkins Joyce did not invent the role she played. She stepped into a space that already existed, carved out by laws that restricted inheritance professions that excluded women and cultural scripts that rewarded beauty while distrusting autonomy. In such a system, power was rarely granted outright. It was borrowed, leased, or accessed through proximity. Marriage became not merely a personal arrangement, but an economic strategy, and romance itself learned to speak the language of contracts. To understand why her story matters is to understand why so many women of her era, especially those without family fortunes or political names, treated intimacy as infrastructure. They were not chasing excess for its own sake. They were attempting to construct stability in a world that offered them none without conditions. Her life unfolded during a moment when visibility itself was becoming a form of power. The early 20th century transformed newspapers, theater, and later film into machines that manufactured public figures faster than institutions could absorb them. A woman no longer needed to govern or invent to become famous. She needed only to be interesting enough to watch. Peggy Hopkins Joyce understood this instinctively. She treated attention not as a byproduct of wealth, but as a resource parallel to it, something that could be cultivated, directed, and exchanged. Yet attention is a volatile currency. It rewards amplification, not depth, and it demands escalation to remain effective. Each marriage had to be richer than the last, each jewel larger, each scandal more legible to the public imagination. The machine that lifted her also required her to remain legible as spectacle frozen in a role that did not allow aging retreat or complexity. This is where the question begins to sharpen: what happens when a woman mistakes visibility for control and power for permanence? Her story is often reduced to numbers. How many husbands, how many diamonds, how much money exchanged hands, but those figures obscure the more durable pattern beneath them. She lived in a culture that framed female ambition as either immoral or ridiculous, unless it was disguised as romance. Wanting money directly was suspect. Wanting love that came with money was tolerated, even celebrated, as long as it could be framed as charm rather than calculation. Peggy Hopkins Joyce refused to pretend she was unaware of the transaction. She spoke openly about money, about jewels, about expectations, and this honesty, unusual for a woman in her position, both fascinated and repelled the public. She became a symbol of excess, not because she wanted more than others, but because she said so plainly that wanting was the point. The question her life poses is not whether she went too far, but whether there was ever a place she could have safely stopped. The broader pattern her story illuminates is the illusion that power acquired through others can be secured through repetition. Each marriage promised insulation from the last failure, as if enough wealth accumulated across different men could eventually add up to independence. But dependence, once normalized, rarely dissolves simply because the scale increases. Each union bound her more tightly to the same logic access, granted conditionally revoked when the terms shifted. When relationships soured, she was not left merely heartbroken but structurally vulnerable because the world she had built relied on continual affirmation from men who could withdraw it. This dynamic was not unique to her. It echoed through the lives of heiresses, actresses, socialites, and courtesans whose names survive mostly as footnotes or jokes. Peggy Hopkins Joyce endures because she refused to disappear quietly. She insisted on being seen, even when visibility worked against her. There is also the question of agency, often simplified into a false binary. Was she a manipulator or a victim? The historical record resists such clarity. She negotiated aggressively, demanded settlements, and understood the leverage she possessed. At the same time, the options available to her were sharply limited by gender, class, origin, and the legal structures of marriage and divorce. Agency exercised within constraint can look indistinguishable from complicity, especially when judged from a distance. Her life invites a more uncomfortable inquiry. How much freedom exists when the tools available for survival require self-erasure performance and continual reinvention? And what happens to a person who becomes too skilled at turning with herself into an object of exchange? Why this story matters now is not because the conditions are identical, but because the pattern persists in different forms. Modern visibility still promises autonomy while quietly extracting it. The mechanisms have changed, but the logic remains familiar. Attention converts to access, access to money, money to a fragile sense of safety that must be defended constantly against irrelevance. Peggy Hopkins Joyce lived early enough to see the beginning of this economy and long enough to be discarded by it. Her life becomes a question rather than an answer, hovering uncomfortably between admiration and unease. Was her relentless pursuit of wealth a rational adaptation to a hostile system, or did the system succeed precisely because it taught her to believe that accumulation could replace security? The documentary does not resolve this tension. It follows it step by step back to its origins, where the desire for control first learned the language of survival. She was born Emma Marguerite Upton in 1,893 inches, a small town in Virginia that offered neither anonymity nor opportunity, only the quiet pressure of expectations formed long before she arrived. Her father was a newspaper man, her mother, a woman whose ambitions were circumscribed by marriage and geography, and together they represented a respectable but fragile middle-class stability, secure enough to promise aspiration, unstable enough to make its loss terrifying. The household was not one of deprivation, but neither was it a place of ease. Money existed as a concern, not an abundance, and from an early age, she absorbed the lesson that security was conditional, dependent on forces beyond sentiment. When her parents separated, the rupture carried a psychological weight far heavier than the legal one. Divorce in that era was not simply a private failure. It was a social fracture that redefined a child's position in the world. The family's standing thinned, the future narrowed, and the young girl learned that women bore the aftershocks of instability most directly, often without recourse. Her mother remarried, and with that remarriage came movement, geographic, emotional, and social. The new household offered access to education and refinement, but it also reinforced a crucial lesson: belonging was achieved through adjustment. Names could change, circumstances could be revised, identity itself was flexible if flexibility ensured survival. At boarding school, among girls trained to polish accents and posture as carefully as thoughts, she learned the grammar of upward movement. Appearance mattered. Composure mattered. Desire, if expressed at all, had to be translated into something socially acceptable. Ambition softened into charm. Hunger disguised as confidence. She was not exceptional for learning these rules. She was exceptional for how quickly she mastered them and how little illusion she retained about their purpose. School did not offer her a vocation or an intellectual refuge. It offered her preparation. She left home young, drawn not by rebellion but by momentum. Vaudeville and the traveling stage provided an education in impermanence. Cities blurred together, applause rose and fell, contracts ended without ceremony. The body became both instrument and liability, valued for its ability to attract attention, and discarded when novelty faded. In that environment, she learned to read rooms with precision, to understand desire before it was spoken, and to equate stillness with danger. Security, if it existed at all, would have to be seized quickly and reinforced constantly. It was during this period that she first encountered wealth, not as an abstraction, but as a physical presence. Men whose money insulated them from consequence, whose mistakes were absorbed by resources rather than punished by circumstance. The contrast was instructive. She did not romanticize them. She studied them. Her first marriage, contracted while she was still legally underage, was less a union than a transaction conducted prematurely. It ended almost immediately annulled when its legality became inconvenient, but the brevity did not diminish its impact. In that short interval, she glimpsed what proximity to money could do, how doors opened, how tone shifted, how fear receded. She also learned how quickly that access could be revoked, how little protection sentiment provided once the structure collapsed. The lesson embedded itself deeply. Love was unstable, status was provisional, only leverage endured, and leverage had to be maintained. By the time she re-emerged under a new name, Peggy Hopkins Joyce, the transformation was not cosmetic. It was architectural. The psychological blueprint was set: movement over attachment, acquisition over trust, visibility over safety. These were not vices cultivated in decadence. They were strategies formed in response to precarity, refined through repetition, and hardened into instinct long before the world learned to watch her closely. Her ascent did not begin with fame, but with alignment. She positioned herself where wealth circulated, where men accustomed to command mistook admiration for loyalty and access for affection. Marriage became the primary instrument through which she translated proximity into material security, but each union also functioned as an apprenticeship in power. She observed how fortunes were managed, how influence was exercised quietly rather than declared, how reputation could be shaped through selective disclosure and strategic silence. Her second marriage to a prosperous banker delivered not only money but legitimacy, a surname that allowed her entry into social spaces previously closed to her. Yet legitimacy carried its own cost. Respectability demanded restraint, and restraint felt indistinguishable from erasure. The marriage deteriorated under the strain of incompatible expectations, ending in divorce that confirmed another pattern: wealth could be accessed, but it could not be held without surrender. Each subsequent marriage followed a similar arc, but with escalating stakes. She married men whose fortunes were larger, whose social positions were more visible, whose tolerance for independence was thinner. The pattern was not accidental. She was refining a method, testing how much autonomy could be extracted before the structure collapsed. Diamonds became both symbol and safeguard, portable wealth that could be worn, displayed, and, if necessary, liquidated. She insisted on extravagant settlements, not out of vanity, but calculation. Marriage contracts were negotiated with the clarity of business arrangements, and she made no attempt to disguise this fact. The public interpreted her candor as brazenness, even vulgarity, but beneath it lay a disciplined understanding of risk. She knew that sentiment evaporated faster than assets. As her name circulated, so did her image. She learned to collaborate with the press rather than resist it, offering access on her terms, shaping narratives before others could impose them. She became a figure of fascination precisely because she refused the expected posture of feminine discretion. She spoke openly about money, about desire, about disappointment. This transparency, rare and unsettling, functioned as both armor and provocation. It granted her control over the story at the cost of constant exposure. Privacy became impossible, but relevance remained intact. In an era that punished women for ambition, unless it was disguised, she chose visibility over approval, understanding that condemnation still kept her in circulation. Yet beneath the appearance of command, autonomy was narrowing. Each alliance required adaptation to another man's expectations, another household's rules, another fortune's contingencies. Power accrued, but it was fragmented, never fully consolidated. She moved through luxurious spaces without owning the ground beneath her feet, dependent on arrangements that could be dissolved with signatures she did not control. The discipline required to maintain this life was immense. Emotional flexibility became mandatory. Attachment became dangerous. Identity itself was modular, adjusted to fit the role required in each new context. What looked like freedom from the outside was internally a life governed by vigilance. By the time she entered the public imagination as a fully formed symbol, rich, notorious, adorned, her formation was complete. She had been trained not by institutions but by repetition, not by ideology but by consequence. She understood power as something external, something to be accessed rather than generated, and this understanding shaped every decision that followed. The loss of autonomy was gradual, disguised as opportunity, absorbed as necessity. She did not perceive herself as constrained. She perceived herself as effective. And in that perception lay the quiet tragedy already unfolding long before the world would call it excess or downfall. By the early 1922s, Peggy Hopkins Joyce no longer needed introduction. Her name circulated independently of her presence, arriving in rooms before she did, trailing expectations of extravagance and disruption. She had entered a social stratum where money was no longer merely possessed but ritualized, where dinners, yachts, apartments, and jewels were instruments through which hierarchy was rehearsed daily. She moved through this world with a fluency that appeared effortless, but was in fact the result of sustained observation and adaptation. Wealth did not intimidate her. It clarified her position. She understood that admiration was abundant, but loyalty was scarce, and she structured her life accordingly, surrounding herself with objects that could not withdraw affection or change their minds. Her marriages during this period brought her into direct contact with industrial fortunes and financial power that dwarfed anything she had previously known. Each union elevated her material circumstances while reinforcing her public image as a woman who extracted value from intimacy without apology. The press chronicled her jewels with forensic interest listing carats and costs as if they were economic indicators. Diamonds the size of fortunes appeared at her throat, and hands not as decoration but as declaration. They announced that she had arrived, and that arrival itself was an event worth documenting. Luxury became her environment rather than her reward. Apartments were chosen for visibility as much as comfort parties staged with an understanding of how they would read the next morning in print. She lived as if being observed were a permanent condition, adjusting her movements to remain legible under scrutiny. Yet beneath the spectacle there was a persistent quietness. Power insulated her from certain fears, poverty, obscurity, but it introduced others more subtle and corrosive. Relationships became provisional, structured around advantage rather than trust. Friends were often spectators, allies contingent on relevance. Men admired her but rarely knew her, mistaking proximity for understanding. The emotional architecture of her life flattened under the weight of display. There was little room for unrecorded moments, fewer still for vulnerability. Silence, when it occurred, felt less like rest than exposure. Society rewarded her performance generously. She was invited, quoted, photographed. She occupied a space reserved for women who existed slightly outside respectability but remained indispensable to its mythology. She demonstrated what money could buy when coupled with audacity, and this demonstration fascinated a public navigating its own anxieties about wealth, morality, and modernity. Her life functioned as both fantasy and caution, though the line between the two was often indistinct. To watch her was to witness ascent without institutional sanction, power achieved without office influence, exercised without title, and yet even at her peak the structure supporting her was fragile. The admiration she received was conditional, dependent on her continued ability to surprise, to exceed, to remain useful as spectacle. Power flowed toward her, but it did not root itself. It passed through, leaving traces, but never settling long enough to become shelter. At a certain point, the repetition of success began to feel like mastery. Peggy Hopkins Joyce had navigated multiple marriages, extracted substantial settlements, and survived public scrutiny without retreat. Patterns that once required vigilance now felt predictable. She believed she understood the mechanisms governing her life, how men behaved when flattered, how the press responded to provocation, how wealth could be converted into autonomy if managed decisively. Confidence replaced caution. She spoke with authority about money and marriage, presenting herself as someone who had solved a problem others merely endured. The illusion was not that she lacked intelligence or insight, but that insight alone could neutralize structural vulnerability. This sense of control manifested in escalation. Settlements grew larger, demands more explicit. She insisted on diamonds not only as compensation, but as insurance-portable evidence of her leverage. She treated negotiations as performances of dominance, confident that visibility itself protected her. The public persona hardened into something almost ceremonial, the woman who always won, who left marriages richer than she entered them, who refused to pretend that love and finance occupied separate spheres. In private, however, the cost of this posture accumulated. Emotional detachment became habitual, less a strategy than a reflex. Trust was replaced by contracts, intimacy by surveillance. She monitored relationships for signs of withdrawal, interpreting affection through the lens of durability rather than sincerity. Warning signs appeared subtle but persistent. Her reputation shifted from fascination toward fatigue. What once shocked now repeated. Excess, when sustained too long, loses its capacity to disrupt and becomes background noise. Men of means grew cautious, less enchanted by notoriety, more attentive to discretion. Legal structures evolved, divorce settlements scrutinized with increasing rigor. The environment that had once rewarded her candor began to resist it. Yet she dismissed these changes as temporary anomalies rather than indicators. The belief in her own adaptability obscured the possibility that the rules themselves were shifting. Control, once perceived as external over men-money narrative, had narrowed into control over image alone. She could still command attention, but attention no longer guaranteed advantage. The very skills that had secured her ascent now constrained her response. Retreat felt like failure. Reinvention felt unnecessary. She doubled down on methods that had worked before, mistaking familiarity for safety. The illusion of control persisted precisely because collapse had not yet arrived. Consequences lagged behind decisions, creating a false sense of immunity. She remained convinced that she was directing her life, unaware that the margins for maneuver had thinned. That power, borrowed too many times, eventually demands repayment. The flaw that ultimately governed her life was not greed in the vulgar sense, nor vanity alone, but an unyielding faith in accumulation as protection. Peggy Hopkins Joyce believed with a conviction shaped by years of instability that if enough wealth could be gathered, converted, and secured, it would finally neutralize risk. Money was not indulgence, it was armor. Each marriage, each negotiation, each demand for jewels rather than promises reinforced this belief. What she failed to perceive was that the strategy itself required perpetual motion. Accumulation without consolidation created exposure rather than safety, and the faster she moved, the more visible the seams became. As she aged, the conditions that had once made her formidable began to erode quietly. Beauty, which she had never treated as mere ornament, lost its currency in a culture that prized novelty above continuity. Men who might once have tolerated notoriety now sought insulation from it. The legal environment hardened. Divorce ceased to be an arena where audacity could reliably triumph. Settlements became constrained, reputations scrutinized less indulgently. Yet she responded not by altering her approach, but by intensifying it. Demands grew sharper. Publicity became more deliberate. She spoke more openly, asserted her expectations with greater force, as if volume could compensate for leverage already diminishing. This was the irreversible turn, the refusal to abandon a framework that no longer supported her. She continued to treat relationships as transactions long after the market had shifted, and in doing so, she narrowed her options further. Where once she had been perceived as shrewd, she was now dismissed as excessive. Where once she had seemed modern, she appeared increasingly anachronistic, a relic of an era when spectacle still guaranteed advantage. The pattern that had sustained her life reached its breaking point not through a single scandal or decision, but through exhaustion. The system she relied upon did not collapse dramatically. It simply stopped responding. And without response, accumulation lost its meaning. The collapse did not arrive as ruin in the theatrical sense. There was no singular disgrace, no public trial that neatly resolved her reputation. Instead, the unraveling was gradual, marked by shrinking relevance and tightening circumstances. Wealth remained, but it no longer functioned as insulation. The diamonds that once symbolized triumph became static objects, reminders of past leverage rather than active safeguards. Opportunities narrowed, invitations slowed. The press, once eager to chronicle her excesses, turned its attention elsewhere. Silence replaced fascination, and silence proved far more dangerous. Her later marriages failed to restore momentum. The men she encountered no longer represented ascent, but containment, and even that containment was temporary. Relationships fractured under the weight of mutual disappointment. She discovered that visibility without novelty offers little protection, and notoriety without leverage invites disregard. Legal battles drained resources. Health issues emerged, undermining the control she had so carefully performed. The body, long treated as instrument, began to assert its own limits. Isolation followed, not abruptly but through attrition. Networks dissolved. Allies drifted. The social world that had once defined her existence reconfigured itself without her at its center. She was not destitute, but she was no longer dominant. Power, which had seemed cumulative, revealed itself as situational. Once the situation changed, the power receded, leaving her exposed to the ordinary vulnerabilities she had spent her life trying to outrun. The collapse felt inevitable in retrospect, not because her choices were irrational, but because they were consistent long after consistency became liability. Her final years were marked by contraction. The radius of her life shrank from cities and headlines to rooms and routines. Illness imposed a stillness she had never cultivated voluntarily. The world she had navigated through motion and negotiation now demanded patience and surrender. When she died in 1957, the response was muted. Obituaries acknowledged her notoriety but struggled to place it, unsure how to frame a life built on visibility, once visibility itself had faded. The contrast between her peak and her end was stark but not exceptional. She did not fall from a throne. She stepped out of a spotlight that no longer followed her. What remained was not disgrace, but quiet irrelevance, the condition she had resisted more fiercely than poverty or scandal. In death, she became what she had always been at risk of becoming, a figure defined more by what she represented than by what she possessed. Her story lingers because it resists simple interpretation. She was neither heroine nor cautionary tale in the traditional sense. She navigated the constraints of her era with intelligence and audacity, yet the tools available to her required perpetual self-conversion into commodity. Power, as she accessed it, was always external, always contingent, always revocable. The haunting reflection is not that she failed to secure permanence, but that permanence may never have been available through the means she was taught to trust. The life of Peggy Hopkins Joyce ends not with judgment, but with an unresolved question suspended in silence. When survival demands performance and performance becomes identity, what remains when the audience finally leaves?